All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. So great to be watching the YouTube numbers climb as groups are tuning in for today's event with Liv Grant. Normally, we'd be broadcasting live into classrooms across North America and beyond, which is why it's so great that we're still able to keep these events running, but instead broadcast them to the homes of parents, educators, and students all across North America. We've got a really great event on tap for today. If you would like to join in the Slido room today, I posted the link in the chat sidebar on the right. The link is there, and then you need to put in the event code ISLAND to join. Once you're there, you'll see there's a poll question to get you started. And then at the end of the chat, we are going to have a little quiz to see how well you were paying attention to Liv's chat today. So use that chat sidebar, let us know who you are and where you're watching from, and of course, send us in a couple of questions. All right, let's get on to the main event. We're pretty excited to have Liv Grant joining us today. She is a biologist and wildlife filmmaker, sponsored by organizations like Scientific Exploration Society, BirdLife International, and the Laurel Park Foundation. She graduated with a degree from the University of Oxford, has conducted scientific research with the University of Cambridge, and currently works on documentaries and journalism for organizations like The Guardian, BBC, and Netflix. She recently led an expedition to one of the most remote islands in the South Pacific, where she studied the vanishingly rare, beautiful parrot called the Ultramarine Lorikeet. Liv, it's so great to have you joining us live today from the UK. We're excited to get to know you a little bit better, hear about this awesome expedition, and of course, we'll fire away with a little Q&A action.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm so excited to be here right now. And I'm going to start off by telling you guys about why on earth I ended up making a journey to one of the most remote islands in the world. And it began because in my final year of university, I was faced with this enormous pile of homework. I had so much work to do. And I decided that just to warm up to it a little bit, I would go and read some old National Geographic magazines because I needed some inspiration to get going on all this work. And I came across a story about a bird called the Ultramarine Lorikeet, which was described as being so blue, it looked like a piece of the sea had been flung into the sky. And I was immediately intrigued by this and decided to try and find out a little bit more about it. So I did some Googling and I found that it lived in the South Pacific. Now you should be able to see a map right here. I'm not sure if many of you know about the South Pacific, but the largest island in the area is Australia, but there are thousands more islands there. There's actually 500,000 islands in the world, and many of them are in the South Pacific, which is also our largest ocean. Now, this bird, the Ultramarine Lorikeet, lived in an archipelago, which means a group of islands called the Marquesas Islands. And these islands are right here in French Polynesia. Now, it's a little bit hard to understand exactly how remote this group of islands is without seeing it on a globe, because everything looks a little bit different on a flat map. So here you go. And I read about this bird and saw that it was critically endangered, which meant that it was one of the rarest birds in the world. There are actually less than 2,000 of them left in the world, and they all live on just one tiny island. Now, you may be wondering, how on earth did these birds get there? Well, they were actually blown there across many, many generations. The type of bird that they are is called the lorikeet, which is a type of parrot. And they're special for one very weird reason. And I'm going to show you a picture of why they're so special in a second, but it's a little bit gross, so sorry about that. They have these amazing tongues, which are sort of brush-shaped. Now, this gave these birds, which evolved in New Guinea, which is an island above Australia, the ability to drink nectar from flowers and also drink the juice from fruits, which gave them this huge amount of freedom to live on islands where there are very few fruits or seeds. Now, what was so wonderful about living in such a remote place is that there were very few other animals there. So when these ultramarine lorikeets arrived on these islands, they were in a sort of paradise. They had very few competitors, just some seabirds, and no predators. There were no mammals that lived on these islands or predatory birds. So they're able to flourish, and they lived on 6 different islands. Now, how would other animals arrive there? Well, only really very few species can actually fly. So other animals arrived by the sea. And about 1,000 years ago, humans arrived on these islands. You can see a picture here of one man on the tip of an island collecting seabird eggs. Now, the Marquesas Islands are one of the last habitable places on Earth to have been reached by man. And when people arrived, what followed next was actually really terrible for the wildlife. There was massive destruction of the wildlife that was there. 2 other species of parrots disappeared, and many seabirds were made extinct. However, I was going to find all of this out when I traveled there. So I traveled there 2 years ago with a team of people to go and study the threats which were facing the ultramarine lorikeet. Now, whenever you do a scientific expedition, you have to travel with a few other people because you need a team to be able to address all of the problems that you want to tackle. So I worked with a filmmaker, a conservationist, and a fellow university student, and also a local wildlife expert who was able to show us all of the unique places where we could see the lorikeet and tell us more about the changes he had seen in the land. Now, here is the ultramarine lorikeet. You can probably see why I fell in love with it. It is such a small and beautiful bird, and this is a very young one perched on the end of a banana flower. When we arrived on the island, we were delighted to see that the trees were full of these birds. They are incredibly fast flying, and they fly in little groups of a male, a female, and a baby, and they are constantly calling to another with a sort of psh, psh call, which is probably not the squawk you would expect of parrots, but it was good because it meant we could at least tell where they were. Now, the primary purpose of our expedition was to count these birds. And counting birds is kind of tricky because they're constantly flying everywhere and they never settle down. So the way that you do this, or the way that you count birds, is that you walk very, very slowly at a pace of just 2 kilometers an hour, which, you know, is, I mean, it's like you're kind of trying to slow yourself down. It's so slow. And you count how many birds you see within a certain distance of where you're walking. You then also take a look at the habitat that you're in and create a map of an area and get other people to analyze exactly how many birds you would expect to find in the rest of the island, because it's impossible to actually measure, count every single bird on the island. So it's a little bit tricky. Now, we looked at one other species of bird when we were in the Marquesas Islands, and this is called the Iphas monarch. Monarch means regal or sort of king or ruler, and it's a little bit funny to see such a plain looking bird with really such a fancy name, but we kind of realized why it had such a pompous name when we met them and realized that they had these incredibly pompous and curious personalities. Iphas monarchs are highly territorial. And as soon as anybody walks into their little patch of land, they immediately swoop down and start displaying to you. So they'll lift up their tails in a little dance of dominance. Now, we found that one way to really communicate with them, or perhaps just annoy them, was to make a bit of extra noise. And the way that we were taught to do this by the locals was to make a squeaky sound. Now, pretty much anybody can make this noise. What you do is you sort of kiss this little dip in your palm right here, and just, yeah, I'll show you. You make that noise and they immediately fly down and start to get incredibly angry, but it's actually fantastic because it means you can get closer to them to study them. So the island of Uahuka is the last island in the Marquesas archipelago where the ultramarine lorikeet lives. And you can see here that there is a huge ridge of mountains in the center of the island. These colored lines show where we counted the birds. And we desperately wanted to cross this ridge of mountains to see the other side of the island, because on the other side of the island, no people lived there. And so we hoped that it would be an example of a beautiful and pristine habitat, and that there would be many, many more ultramarine lorikeets and other birds living there. However, we were told that it was far too dangerous to cross these mountains. And so we had to get a boat and get to the other side. Now, that would have usually been okay. However, we were hit by terrible weather and ended up having to swim from the boat to the shore, which was really quite scary because alongside these beautiful manta rays, we also saw many sharks and very large fish. However, honestly, it was like being in a biologist's dreamland to see all of this wildlife. The ocean life is incredibly rich in the South Pacific because much of it isn't fished. And at night, when we were on the uninhabited edge of the island, we were surrounded by seabirds, which would cascade in from the ocean at dusk to nest. Now, seabirds often spend most of their life at sea, and some species never land except to breed. And so we were amazed to see so many coming in to land at this island. And they were there because they had chicks. There was one species called the white tern, which you can see there. The adults are incredibly elegant and beautiful, and they have very blue beaks and feet. I was so excited to be surrounded by all of them. But we made a little bit of a mistake because we camped beneath a colony of them. As you can see, the chicks are absolutely adorable. And what's really cool about them is that they don't nest in proper nests, they just sit on a branch. So even though the adults are so beautiful and the chicks are so cute and fluffy, it was a terrible idea to camp underneath a colony of them because they produce a lot of poo. And seabird poo is actually called guano, and you can sell it for a huge amount of money because it makes an excellent crop fertilizer. But I can promise you that it will never, ever get out of your clothes or tent. We hiked up many beautiful ridges and valleys. The islands in the South Pacific are often volcanic, and this one had these huge rocks. Each of these rocks was about 1 meter square and is evidence of the fact that these islands are formed from recent volcanoes. You can see in the picture of me there that we use bits of tape to mark our way, but we also use GPS trackers and other technology, because when you're in an uninhabited area, the only paths that are there are made by wild animals, and so you really don't want to get lost. Now, along the way, I learned some useful lessons about the value of wearing long trousers. There was a few lizards, there were many, many sharp branches, and quite a few giant spiders. I didn't mind the lizards or spiders so much. Now, at the top of one of the valleys in the uninhabited region of the island, we came across the remnants of an abandoned village. Polynesians have lived in Marquesas Islands for about 1,000 years. And they built these huge villages that were made up, that often were centered around a large platform of stones called a pai. And on these platforms of stones are where the Polynesians would perform their traditional dances and come together as a community. Now, you can see on one of these stones that there is a little engraving of a face that kind of looks like a monkey's face from here, but it's actually of a tiki, which means God in Polynesian language. You can see on the other large stone here that there are little cups or bowls that have almost been ground or carved into the rock. Now, these are actually caused by the grinding of a nut called kukui nut to produce an ink for tattoos. Polynesia is the birthplace of tattoos, and people used to be absolutely covered in them from head to toe. You can see in this image here of the extent of people's tattooing. And these tattoos would tell people's life stories, their family histories, and where they came from. And they were incredibly important because there was not a written language. And so these symbols were a wonderful way for people to pass down their histories. Now, you might be able to see the writing at the bottom of the picture of the man there, that it says tattooed savage of the Marquesas Islands. This is a reminder of the racist history of the European colonizers who arrived in the Marquesas Islands in the 1700s. Sailors from Europe and America arrived, and they sought to conquer these lands. And some of the things that they did included banning tattooing, surfing, and traditional dancing. All of these were ways in which the Polynesian communities came together and established their pride and their culture. And tattoos were banned for 200 years. The effect of this meant that many people forgot what each of the tattoo patterns meant, and there was a huge loss of identity. However, tattoos are once again allowed in the Marquesas Islands, and they are super popular among people today. You can see that in this picture of me and my friend Annika with the local kayak team. Kayaking is also a large part of Polynesian culture, and in the Marquesas Islands, kayaks are called vacas. Now, here is my colleague Annika holding a black noddy, which is a seabird. We found many black noddy chicks that were on the ground because they had been caught in tree sap from the trees in which they built their nests. A lot of these noddies were completely happy and okay, and once a little bit of sap had been removed from their wings, they were free to fly away. However, we also came across the skeletons of many seabird chicks. And we knew that these were not just the remains of birds which had just fallen out of the nest and died, because there's something slightly suspicious about them. All that was left were their wings. We also came across some other slightly odd patterns in the forest. Here is a picture of one of our campsites, and you can see a tent strung up there. And you can also see perhaps that there's no leaves beneath shoulder height. There's absolutely no grass or shrubbery or leaves on the lower branches of these trees. In some areas of the island, it was even more stark, and it looked more like an alien landscape than what one would expect to find on a tropical island. Now, the causes of the dead seabirds and the bare ground were actually other types of species. Domestic cats were killing the seabirds, and introduced goats were eating the ground. Eating all of the plants that were on the ground and that were really below 1.5 meters high. Now, domestic cats and goats have spread across the South Pacific, and they have terrible effects on the native wildlife because cats have wiped out many species of birds which nest on the ground. And they also will kill the chicks of any birds which can fly, because chicks are often very vulnerable and slow flyers when they're young. Goats cause perhaps an even greater problem because they just completely eradicate the natural landscape and eat any young plants and saplings that are trying to grow. And it is actually a third invasive species which most greatly threatens the ultramarine lorikeet. This is the black rat. Now, the black rat has spread to all of the other inhabited islands in the Marquesas archipelago and has wiped out every single ultramarine lorikeet that is on all of these islands apart from one, called uahuka. You can see, and the reason that they do this is that they eat the eggs and the chicks of the ultramarine lorikeet. Now, you can see in this photo a picture of a lady with a dog. Now, they are part of the solution that is going to protect Uahuka, the last remaining Marquesas island without the black rat, from these rats. And people are working together to check every boat that comes into Uahuka for black rats. And they're using this adorable little Jack Russell Terrier to sniff them out. This has required a huge amount of work from the local community because there's many cargo boats and often tourist boats that come to these islands. And so this year, I returned to the Marquesas Islands to document a very special festival where people were coming together to celebrate the work that they are doing with conservationists. Now, here is a picture of the festival. And as you can see, a man and a woman are dressed in blue. And they have dressed like that because they're going to perform a traditional dance called the Haka Manu, which means bird dance. You may have heard of the New Zealand rugby team's dance called the haka. Well, hakas are performed all across Polynesia, and it simply means dance. And the Marquesas Islands are home to a very special type of dance. And this is the bird dance. This dance has been around for centuries. And traditionally, people would dance to mimic the courtship of seabirds. But this year, or last year, for the first time ever, the islanders of Uahuka dressed in blue and danced to mimic the lifestyle of the ultramarine lorikeet. Everybody from the island got involved, including the young children and all of the adults. To me, this is a really wonderful example of people coming together to celebrate wildlife and to decide to protect it as a community. And in places such as islands where there are very few animals and also not that many people, it is more important than anywhere else for people to come together and to try and protect their wildlife. If the wildlife is protected, then the people's livelihoods for the future are more secure as it all comes together. If there are goats that are wiping out the native plants, this will lead to massive erosion, and so there won't be enough water for crops. If rats arrive, they will not only wipe out the ultramarine lorikeet, they will also eat all of the coconuts which the islanders sell to survive. And whilst the cats may keep some of the rat population down, they also threaten other native seabirds, from which the islanders take a few eggs every year. And so I really hope that all of you can take a moment to think about these very far away places that have very specific and wildlife problems that can thankfully also be stopped. Great, thank you.
All right, awesome, Liv. Thanks for taking us on a little trip out to the remote South Pacific, and those ultramarine lorikeets are pretty amazing looking birds. Thanks for sharing that story with us. And I love the picture of the mantas. It's nothing better than diving with mantas. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to post the link to Slido one more time in the chat sidebar. So it's there. If you go to that site and then use the event code island, you can join in. We're going to do the quiz shortly. But before we do that, we'll take a few questions. You can send questions in via the Slido room, and you can also send questions in via the YouTube live chat, and we will work some of those questions in. And so the first question that we have coming in here is Davina is wondering if you got a chance. So it sounds like you saw the bird dance, but did you get to participate?
Well, I actually did get taught how to do the bird dance, but I didn't participate in the big ceremony they're doing. Now, I've actually made a documentary about the bird dance, so hopefully I can share that in the future. But the girls' part involves doing a lot of arms like this, and the men have to kind of hop around on one leg, imitating the bouncing that the males do to court the females. So it looks like a lot of hard work to do the men's part.
All right, very cool. So we do have lots of people joining in. I'll give a shout out to a few groups that we have joining in here. lots of groups from Ontario and Canada today. So Pembroke, Sudbury, Elmville joining in today. Great to see everybody joining in. And just looking at some of the comments, they loved your talk. They thought the dog was cute and ouch your legs. And that lizard was pretty cool. They thought that was pretty cool on your legs as well. And then Ethan has just sent in a question, and Ethan is wondering, other than the goats, is there anything else that eats the plants on the island?
That's a really good question, actually. There's lots of rare insects which live in the Marquesas Islands, and they eat a lot of the leaves, but there's no native mammals. So it means that there's pretty much no other animals which eat the leaves on the island, which is crazy. But it also means that the plants on this island are super vulnerable when goats do arrive because they haven't adapted to grow fast enough.
All right. So we had a poll question open in the Slido room, which was, had you ever heard of the ultramarine lorikeet before today's talk? So 73% of those tuning in today had not heard of the ultramarine lorikeet before, and 27% did say that they had heard of the bird. And so that brings an interesting question. This question is in the Slido room. This is from Mikey. And Mikey's wondering if people have hunted these birds maybe in the past, or people have visited the islands, ever since the 1700s. Why do you think we don't know more about the ultramarine lorikeets?
Hi, Mikey. Yeah, that's a great question. So the early Polynesians did hunt these birds, and there was actually two other species of parrot which lived on these islands, which were made extinct pretty much as soon as humans arrived, probably because they were hunted to extinction to take the feathers, to trade them and wear them in costumes. Not much is known about these birds because it's just so difficult for scientists to get to these islands to study them. You have to take a lot of very small planes or a very long boat trip to get there. And so it just means that very few people can get there to go and study them.
Okay, so William's curious about how long you spent on the expedition on the island.
So I spent 6 weeks on the first expedition I made there, which is where I just did a scientific study of all of the birds on the island. And then I returned to the island and went to another island at the end of last year, so a few months ago, for 1 month's time.
Okay, so just to those who are tuning in live, I have just opened the quiz. So if you want to jump into the quiz, we're going to start soon. But before we do, and as we wait for people to jump in and pick their names, I will jump to another question from Slido here. So, this is interesting. Do you know, so obviously Gracie's wondering about the ultramarine lorikeet. Do you know if they're in places like Canada and the US, have they maybe been brought to zoos and places like that?
That is such a good question because that is something that I've actually been investigating. There are no ultramarine lorikeets kept in zoos. And the reason for that is that they would be really difficult to keep in captivity. Ultramarine lorikeets are part of a huge family of birds, and a lot of their relatives do not survive in captivity because they fight too much, and they also require so many fresh flowers and so much fresh fruit that it's really expensive and difficult to look after them. So that kind of means that the only place where they can survive is in a natural habitat like their native island, which means that it's all the more important that we protect them.
All right, great question. What about the lizard on your leg? What species was it?
I think that's a species of gecko. Those probably are not native to the Marquesas Islands, but were either brought over by Polynesians or some of the Europeans who came over.
Okay, so invasive species is definitely a problem
Yeah.
in the Marquesas, not just limited to the mammals. There are some lizards, and I'm sure there's some plant species too.
Oh yeah, many plant species.
All right, let's grab one more question before we start the quiz. Let's see. Okay, a few people are asking kind of this similar question here. What can we do? Is there anything we can do to help protect the ultramarine lorikeet? We're obviously far away, whether we're in the UK or in North America. What do you think is something that we could potentially do?
Well, something that, of course, everybody can do is donate money to conservation charities which protect these birds. So one that I would always encourage you to look for is BirdLife International or Island Conservation. But you can also think about what you can do in your own backyard to protect bird species. And something that I always encourage people to do is if they have pet cats, try and keep them indoors as much as possible, and also try to maybe grow wildflowers in your garden and native species and put out bird seed, because birds have a tough time of it in cities as well as these super remote places. Yeah, there's plenty you can do.
All right. And so that leads to another question that just came up about the cats. Do you know where the cats initially came from?
So the cats initially came from the Europeans. They were brought over by sailors, and people love cats because they suppress rats and mice, which are often a huge problem on ships. And they are now kept as pets on the island, but have spread to all areas of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's jump to the quiz. So we have 4 questions in this quiz. For each question, you will have 20 seconds to answer. The faster you answer, the higher your score will be. And these are all questions that Liv talked about in her presentation today. So we'll see how sharp our audience was today. So here we go. I'm going to start the first question. It's up now. How many islands do you think there are in the world? So is it about 100,000, about 40,000, 500,000, or 945? Got about 10 more seconds to answer that question. I see lots of answers coming in. Oh, shifting back and forth. All right, time is up. And 42% went for 500,000 islands. Liv, I think they are correct.
Nice. Yep.
All right, not too shabby. The next highest answer was 33% went for 945. So you can see there's a lot more islands than 945. Good start to the quiz. All right, next question is open. What's a special adaptation of the ultramarine lorikeet? Is it a tongue-like brush, like a brush? Is it that they can't fly, that they call extremely loud, or that their tail is incredibly long? So what do you think? I remember Liv talking about this. It's an adaptation that helped them as they feed. Our time is up, and 92% overwhelmingly went with tongue like a brush. Very cool. And so that, Liv, you said helps them kind of lap up nectar or juice from fruits, which is pretty cool. All right, let's go to our next question. Oh, there we go. 20 seconds. About how many ultramarine lorikeets are left? So is it about 5,000? Was it a little under 2,000? Is it 12 or was it 150 lorikeets? So I know Liv said that they're on one island now, but Liv, it sounded like when you were on that island, it wasn't hard to see them on that one island.
There were plenty of them there, but it's a very small island. So it's only about 30 square kilometers. And also because they're so noisy and bright, they're pretty hard to miss.
Yes, I remember I lived in Australia for a year, and these are a different species, the rainbow lorikeets, and you never had to guess if they were around. They're loud, loud birds. Okay, so 92% again went with a little under 2,000. Good job, everyone.
Right.
The last question coming up. Which is not a threat right now to the ultramarine lorikeet? Is it cats? Is it rats? Is it goats? Or is it overhunting? What do you think is not a threat right now to the ultramarine lorikeet? All right, 5 more seconds. All right, good job, everyone. Cats, rats, and goats are a threat. It sounds like they have a program in place to try and stop rats from getting to the island, but overhunting sounds like it's something that they don't have to worry about right now, and 38% went with that answer. Liv? And let's jump to our leaderboard. Let's see who took home the prize. Leo, first place, 4 out of 4, and he did it in 23 seconds. Sage, 4 out of 4 in 24 seconds, so 1 second short. And then William Carreri, 4 out of 4, he did it in 42 seconds. Good job, everyone, and thanks for taking part in the quiz today. And Liv, we've got a little bit more time left, so let's take another couple questions. Let's see. So let's grab one more from YouTube. Ethan is wondering about Did you get to interact at all with the ultramarine lorikeets on the island, or did they kind of keep their distance?
Yeah, so they're actually pretty shy of humans. And we found that you have to, if you want to get close to one, you pretty much have to crouch down on the ground and maybe put like a coconut frond over your head if you want to get close to one. And then they'll descend from the trees to start feeding on banana flowers. But otherwise, they like to stay away from people.
All right. So I've just posted a link in the chat. This is a link back to our website, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. And there you can find the listing of all the events coming up over the next 2 weeks. And we're adding lots more. So we hope to see your groups joining in a little bit more. But we'll grab another question here from Davina. I think this is a really good one. Davina's wondering, all those blue feathers on their costumes, were those from the actual lorikeets or were they artificial feathers?
So they were actually feathers from chickens which had been dyed. Yeah, so thankfully they weren't from the ultramarine lorikeet, but they were also not totally vegan. Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Well, I mean, they have to eat, so I guess chicken feathers are definitely a better choice than taking them from the lorikeets, which are much rarer.
Yeah, completely.
Awesome. So I have added as well a link to our Twitter. So give us a follow there to keep up to date with updates and all the new events that are coming up. And obviously give us a subscribe on YouTube. If you click that little mountain with the pants on top in the corner, you'll get little updates and little kind of announcements whenever an event goes live. So you can keep up with those. Let's see if there's one more question here in the Slido room. We got tons of questions came in the Slido room today. Let's see. Okay, so Fergus is curious. Well, let's throw this two-part out. Part of it's from Fergus, part of it's from Leo to wrap things up. Leo's wondering how long the lorikeets live, and Fergus wants to take it one step closer. Do you have an idea of when they may have first arrived on the island?
Oh, these are both really good questions. Now, people aren't entirely sure how long they live for, but it's probably for around 10 to 15 years. So quite a nice long lifespan. And we think we know roughly when they arrived on the islands, and that it would have been about 1 million years ago. And the way that scientists calculated this was that they did DNA sequencing of different species of parrots which have arrived in these Polynesian islands, and then compared them all to one another and pieced together this timeline. Yeah, quite complicated, but pretty amazing they can figure that out from a blood sample.
All right, pretty darn cool. Well, a huge shout out to all the groups that joined live today via YouTube. I can see some familiar names like Gaming Champ 3000. So it looks like Robert joined in again, the Hero Brian. So it's great to see students coming in and taking in multiple events from home. That's awesome. Huge shout out to you, Liv. Thanks so much for taking us on this little adventure to French Polynesia and sharing this amazing species with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. And I'll be watching some of the other talks later.
All right, sounds good. Speaking of other talks, if you stick around for about 20 minutes, we're going live with Kristen Lear, and we're going to talk all things bats. So it should be a pretty fun event. She's got some gear and specimens to show us. We'll do another live quiz, of course. So we look forward to seeing any groups who carry on through 11 o'clock today. So Liv, again, thank you so much. Great to host you. We'll definitely have you back. And thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone.